Hey everybody, it's January 15th, 2023 at approximately 3:15 p.m. my time, and we're a day away from celebrating the memory of Martin Luther King and the, of course, all important Martin Luther King Day. A lot of, like all holidays, an excuse for people to get out and travel and go do certain things that are, you know, possible because of an extra day off with work, but it's certainly a solemn day for me, and I have incredible reverence for Martin Luther King. I consider him a prophet in his own way. What he was able to accomplish during his time on earth is nothing short of extraordinary, particularly where he started and how things morphed and ultimately what it became and what we should reflect upon. But, I think a lot of us are, of course, paying attention to the NFL football playoffs. And, if you think about equality and you think about ways in which the African American community writ large has made advancements, obviously look no further than professional sports. A lot of people might roll their eyes and go, "Well, yeah, that's just another version of, the performance artistry for the man, bred in circuses." And I couldn't be anywhere further from that sort of interpretation. To become a professional athlete is way beyond anybody's ability to comprehend, except for those who actually do it. To be able to make it to that level and to maintain health and to get through, everything it takes to compete at that level is extraordinary. And African Americans have been, at the forefront of professional sports now for the last 40 years, maybe 50 years. Percentage wise, population wise, an abundance of athletes make it to the show and become our sports heroes and advance the ball forward of equality, or at least in a level that we certainly respect after African Americans, at least many people in society, because of just incredible achievement. Right now, obviously, a lot of people don't make it to the show that are African American, that never have an opportunity for equality or justice or fairness or other, incredibly horrific realities of this society. And I'm very well aware of that, maybe more than many, because of the work that I do. When I'm reflecting on Martin Luther King, particularly as it relates to economic justice, I am, of course, reminded of what ultimately led to the assassination of Martin Luther King. When he was in Memphis, he was there working with the sanitation workers, protesting at this stage, it was late stage, of economic injustice, which some people might, refer to as economic racism. And, his entire paradigm was that until you get economic justice, you're not going to get justice. And he was absolutely right, and it took his life. The civil rights movement did things that were extraordinary. Of course, the civil rights movement was made possible because of a lot of the progressive movements that took place in the late post-Civil War era that evolved a number of different scenarios in connective tissue between labor rights, environmental rights, women's suffrage, civil rights, and all of those extraordinary sacrifices that took place in the late 1890s through the early, actually early aughts, I guess, of the 1900s, and of course led to Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting. That was only possible because of the aforementioned, and then ultimately, we wind up with the Roaring Twenties and what appeared to be eventually revealed to be bubble capitalism, predatory capitalism, that of course led to the complete collapse of the global economy that led to the Great Depression, and then ultimately World War II, where we had to defeat fascism, right? And so when we defeated fascism, again, it was just another sort of move towards equality, even though we know, anybody who understands that period, that African Americans were, again, treated as second-class citizens, primarily in the Jim Crow South and ultimately in the military as well. I know that, in World War I, and it was depicted brilliantly and, unfortunate at the same time, but, the nature of racism in the military in World War I, black, soldiers couldn't even wear the American uniform. They wore French uniforms. It's absolutely ludicrous while fighting for the United States. But you fast forward to World War II, and of course there There was an evolved stasis for and place for African American soldiers, and like they had in the Civil War, like they had in World War I, and like they did in World War II, um, really just sacrificed uh, their um, being to be recognized as citizens. I mean, the courage and the efforts of African Americans in this country is such an inspiration to me. And then ultimately, it comes out in the form a lot of times in sports that's the most visible. And of course, some of our heroes, from Michael Jordan to Muhammad Ali to Mike Tyson to you name it, came through the opportunity of professional sports. And I mean, my God, baseball, or Jesse Owens is one of the greatest examples of heroics. Uh, I mean, to go to Berlin in front of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler and just take it and prove to the world that no, there's no such thing as white supremacy. I'm the fastest guy alive. I mean, you can't debate reality. You can't debate reality. And we had all of these incredibly horrific times that led to this courageous movements and expressions in all of its directions to ultimately get us to a point where it looked like African Americans were accepted by mainstream society. But African Americans have always been under the thumb of ultimately poverty, going back to Martin Luther King's war on economic racism or systemic racism. And so in our work, The Con, for example, we start by the reflection and the revelations of what I think is still to this day the hardest thing for me to stomach. So our story starts with Addie Polk, a 91-year-old African American widow who lived in her house and owned her house for 4 decades. She and her husband Robert had migrated during the Great Migration from the South to the industrial Midwest because they African Americans were allowed to work in jobs that were vacated by white soldiers that went to World War II, and so African Americans had the opportunity to work in the factories, and they did. And Robert Polk worked in 2 jobs around the clock to save enough money, and of course he was exploited labor at that time. But exploited labor in the Midwest was a big improvement from slavery or Jim Crow in the South. And he had the opportunity to save income and get his piece of the American dream, plus, different elements thanks to courageous activists, in the home lending community enabled some manner of progress that ultimately led to, the reverse redlining. Well, that's a little bit of a foreshadowing for what I want to go to, but redlining was the technique used by banks where they literally would just outline African American neighborhoods or neighborhoods of people of color, of any color, but primarily African American neighborhoods, and they wouldn't lend in those areas. So African Americans didn't have a chance at home ownership. Now they did in pockets in places where there was a lot of industrial base, like in um, uh, Richmond, California, for example. Huge naval shipyards, big fossil fuel industry, that sort of thing, where African Americans had worked in the factories a long time during that industrial time period of American history, and they bought in their communities. And from what I learned interacting with the African American community is that once you achieved a level of home ownership, it was like nirvana. You had finally gotten to the promised land, and so it was the ultimate achievement for many that had come out of the Jim Crow South, for example. Once again, going back to Addie Polk's story, which makes her story so monumentally horrific on so many levels. So in 2008, what had happened was she started to get foreclosure notices, and she went to a lot of different, and she was elderly, and so it's not like she had, the ability to find out who she needed to talk to and people that could help her and everything else. But she definitely went to the sheriff's office. I know that she went to a law office and some others in the community, notifying people that she's getting foreclosure notices that didn't make sense to her because she owned her home. Now, unbeknownst to Addie and unbeknownst to a lot of people, and quite frankly, unbeknownst to a lot of people of you out there, that there's a horrific crime that takes place actually now in a lot of communities of different socioeconomic wealth, but primarily in African American communities, where there's a methodology known as straw buying, where somebody can basically do a stealing an identity theft and pretend on paper that there's somebody who they've gotten information about that owns a home, that has equity in a home, that's lived in a home for a long time, and they can take out loans in that person's name if they have somebody on the inside of the bank working with them in a conspiracy. And that was actually to the tune of billions in the early 2000s throughout the industrial Midwest. We know that there was rackets run in Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, and Pittsburgh. A lot of the industrial Rust Belt sort of regions where a lot of these elderly widows had owned their homes because their husbands had passed away and they inherited the homes and they lived on fixed income, and they became targets. In fact, they became targets of this whole thing, and it's this predatory lending scenario that led to liar's loans, and that's another aspect of the grift. But in the straw buying, it appears that they stole Addie Polk's home. The sheriffs show up to evict her, and she ends up having to shoot herself 5 times in the chest, 4 times of which hit, using her husband's gun instead of face the horror of living out on the streets after you had been in your house, for 4 decades. And the story that we understood of Miss Addie Polk was that she went to church every Sunday. She was a respected member of the community. She had great pride. She managed her business. And then here she was being thrown out of the streets. I think that a story like this, it would confound most of us. That's not possible. Oh yeah, it was possible. And it happened in tens of thousands of cases. The FBI broke up a situation that I think was it was many billions of dollars that was happening in the early 2000s. And this preceded what ultimately happened in the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. And as we show you in the con and also other work that we've done called the New Untouchables, we ultimately in our research found out, and this is the most remarkable part of it of all. And before I get there, I want to make you aware that 55% of the African American household wealth had evaporated in 2008. A lot of people in the African American community that weren't in the poverty level, that weren't fixed income, that weren't living on what was left by their deceased husbands, in a scenario like Addie Polk. Many of those that were predated upon were doctors, were attorneys, professionals that were also given monstrously fictitious loans based on predation and what they call created yield spread premium, which in the paperwork you create all sorts of deceptive acts and practices that even professionals didn't recognize, and they were set up, with the worst performers on a loan. In terms of the parameters of loan, and they were targeted for being African American. In fact, at Wells Fargo, it was so lucrative it just became one of the main tiers of Wells Fargo's income, and I think it was actually, from what I understand, predatory lending was making more money than any other division of the bank in this time period, and so. It was like a nuclear bomb to the African American community that had overcome the Great Migration from Jim Crow, that got through redlining and ultimately into these new sort of parameters that ultimately became what's known as the Community Reinvestment Act, which demanded that banks that were in specific communities had to make loans within a 50 square mile radius. Now, when the economy imploded in 2008, the first, as they always do, set of victims, I guess I'm trying to think of the right term, but it's the demographic is all I'm trying to say. Very simple term. That was targeted for blame were African Americans. Where politicians, especially on the right, were saying things like, "Look, we were loaning money to people that couldn't afford it because the government made us do it." First of all, the government didn't make banks do liar's loans. There's a lot of people in lower income communities that have enough income to afford the real estate in those areas, if the underwriting is correct and the appraisals of the houses are correct, and it's kind of comports to the economic, box, if you will, of that area, right? I mean, the way it works in all of supposedly free markets is that, if you're going to have different segments of society where people work in different segments of society. They're going to have specific incomes of society, so they're going to only be able to afford specific aspects of what's priced in those particular communities. And so when you think of housing, housing would have to be priced relative to what the income is, particularly if you do all of the right underwriting and the right appraisals and that sort of thing, based on the stopgaps that provide, the tools of why we lend in the first place, based on risk, right? So, for example, you could have a low-income worker that works in a fast food restaurant, but that's been there for 5 years, maybe manages or whatever, and makes enough money to afford the houses in that community to get a loan. That would make sense, wouldn't it? Of course it would. But what ultimately happened is they had redlining to where they didn't provide African Americans any opportunities for lending, and then they went into full predation in African American communities because there was so much money to be made for brokers and underwriters based on these lending practices that were predatory. And you might ask yourself, well, why would anybody loan to somebody that they couldn't afford to pay back? Why would they hyperinflate the asset of a house to loan against if they knew that that house wasn't worth that much? Well, again, it leads to fees, it leads to yield spread premium and short-term situations that ultimately these banks could flip into securitization, and they could refinance, and they could do a whole host of things that they did for, quite frankly, I guess we're talking about 15 years from the mid 90s through the mid 2000s that blew up in 2008. But because of all of these predation schemes, you get to this scenario where it's like Martin Luther King had warned us against economic racism, systemic racism. And then in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, a lot of the leading academics from African American leadership and that sort of thing. I think of Dr. Cornel West among them, one of the smartest guys I've ever heard in my life. He doesn't understand the mechanics of predation and the details of control fraud that enabled what it is when he says loosely in somewhat from a, like the same way Bernie Sanders talks about billionaires. I mean, they do it in platitudes. They don't do it in specifics. They don't talk about how underwriting standards were manipulated or straw buying techniques happened to steal equity, or equity stripping was another part of this thing, all of which is under the umbrella of predatory loans. And then ultimately what we got to is liar's loans. There was such it's like blood in the water for piranhas or hyenas, that because of the lending apparatuses, there was such an appetite to create mortgage-backed securities, and they wanted to get people into loans as quickly as they could to fuel that demand. And I'm talking about Wall Street and investment banks that were providing warehouse lines to what we call pretender lenders that were, combing out through all of the neighborhoods and finding people like Addie Polk to lend to or to steal her house. That's just what it was. And so it was financial terrorism in the form of brokers. They didn't carry out these thefts, these wide thefts with guns. They did it with calculators. And people bought into it because it's really easy to set people up. If they live on a fixed income, you tell them their house is worth more than it is, that they could get X amount of money from these loans to offset what had become, basically stagnant. When you live on a fixed income, you only have X amount of money coming through the pipeline, but yet your cost for medicine, your cost for food, your cost for fuel, your cost for transportation, all of those things have inflated. So you look at it and you look at the numbers and they're telling you your house is worth X amount, and you're like, oh my God, I can get a loan and I can have money, problem solved, like manna from heaven. But what they were doing is they were setting you up to fail. And that's what happened over and over and over. Now, some people definitely were able to refinance and, do partitions on their house and maybe go buy cars and go, on vacations and all of those things that, many on the right have accused them for. But again, it was all a setup based on this is what your house is valued at. And what we learned, for example, because we did a lot of interaction with really one of the smartest group of investigators I've ever come across was the Summit County Task Force that ultimately knew that there were certain neighborhoods and streets in neighborhoods where houses were selling for X amount for the course of the last 40 years, maybe with let's call it a 3 to 6% modest increase per year, based on all of the numbers that kind of go into those appraisals, and then suddenly would increase to over like 150% in a span of like 6 months, and then over and over and over. And so they knew something was up, right? So again, why would brokers and banks, hyperinflate the loan and, lend so much more money to somebody that couldn't pay it back? Because they never owned the loan and they were getting fees on it and they were just packaging it up and moving it to the next level, and that's what they were incentivized to do. And usually, a lot of these brokers, by the way, they were people that were working in fast food or low income situations, and they got incentivized by making huge commissions on these high yield spread premium deals to where they would make more in a single loan than that they would make, an entire year. And eventually, it just led to like this inferno, this cataclysm of fraud. So what the industry was doing was it was actually incentivizing brokers to get as many loans in the pipeline as they could. And it got to the point where these guys working in these communities just made up paperwork and got stuff in as quickly as possible, got their commission, in some cases sold loans on houses that didn't even exist, liar's loans. Or they sold loans to people who didn't have income, liar's loans, that didn't have an asset, that didn't have any wherewithal to be able to pay it back, and then just changed the figures on these applications to get them approved. And then ultimately, even the most smart borrowers that live within the Beltway, for example, in the D.C. area, where we know Prince George's counties, I think, had the highest rate of foreclosures. And there's a lot of professionals that are African American, college educated, probably masters, work in the military, this and that. They got set up. Okay, the whole thing was a ginormous scheme, and again, it evaporated 55% of African Americans' net worth, household net worth, that just evaporated all the gains that came from what 400 years of slavery through the Jim Crow South, through all of these horrific scenarios that once again mirror what the great Martin Luther King had warned us about and was fighting the day he was assassinated. And one of the microdocs that we put on our website at www.thecon.tv, if you go to videos and you scroll down and you look for Christopher Cruz, a trainer, you'll look at how affinity fraud was baked into the system. Guys like Christopher Cruz, which were recruiters and they trained mortgage brokers and that sort of thing to go into churches, to go into Boy Scout coops, to go to sporting events, to go to whatever, with a group of people that they got along with or they look like or they talk like and everything else, and they'd sucker these people in these loans. Just like it's explored in the latest Bernie Madoff documentary that shows it happened to the Jewish community with Bernie Madoff. And a lot of those folks were smart. A lot of them had a lot of money, but they got grifted, and they all followed, what they thought instinctually was like, hey, here's a guy, Bernie Madoff, who is, got this tremendous reputation, and everybody that's in my synagogue or in my country club or whatever is going to. So obviously everybody did their due diligence, and he's, they're all getting paid back, and he's not looking for my business, so I want to go to him. There's a lot of psychology in this type of stuff. And so kind of going back to what happened in the African-American communities, get a load of this. This is the most telling thing of all, and this is the most horrific thing that I have ever come across in my life. But in our investigations, we met two incredible professionals and investigators at one point, but they're attorneys, and they've worked a lot in a lot of these types of arenas, for consumer protection and also particularly predation and that sort of thing. But a woman by the name of Kathleen Engel and another woman by the name of Patricia McCoy were in the Cleveland area at about the 2001 era, and they started getting phone calls, especially for Kathleen Engel, at dinner, where brokers would call and say, hey, we'll offer you X amount for your house. Can we come out and write you a loan? And she's like, something seems really weird about this. One thing leads to another. She starts to poke around, and she starts to realize this is on overdrive in the African American communities. So she pulls up with Patricia McCoy. They do the investigation. They get the research. They find out this is a thing. And they also found out that a lot of these brokers would go to City Hall, and they would look and they would find through the Registry of Deeds those who had equity, and then they would target women, particularly widows. And they would also be able to cross-reference, because at that time there was a lot of fines for houses in these minority communities, blight fines. So, for example, the city would find somebody if they needed to get their roof fixed, or if they needed to get their sidewalk fixed, or something along those lines, dilapidation to a house. And so people on fixed income who own their houses would have to come up with $5,000 to fix the roof or driveway or whatever the case is, or otherwise they'd be fined. And so these brokers would look and they'd find out who had equity in their house, who had a fine on their house, who, they do the math and they'd figure out, well, these guys are perfect targets for these predatory loans. They'd show up on the door, knock on the door, and again, like I said, manna from heaven. They'd get them into a high yield adjustable rate loan that they didn't understand. They got their money up front. They had no idea what they were getting into, and the next thing you know, several years later, they're getting in the crosshairs of foreclosure because they can't afford, the hyperinflated rate that was on the back end for some of these, what they would call, oh God, what's the terminology? There's a handful of these loans, negative amortization and that sort of thing, where you pay like a very tiny amount up front, maybe for like 5-6 years, and then all of a sudden it goes up, in this adjustable rate, and all of a sudden you're faced with a payment that you didn't know existed, and you didn't understand, and then you're going to foreclose because you can't come up with the payments. By the way, a lot of the times, a lot of the people in these minority communities were like Latino, and so brokers would speak to them in Spanish, but when they gave them the contracts, they were in English, and so none of these people read it. They just took their word for it and they got into it, and boom, they got crushed. Okay, there's a lot of ridiculous things that happen, like a lot of people that had tiny incomes that got huge houses with big what's the word I'm looking for, appraisals on these particular plots of land or houses themselves, and they could never in a million years afford it, but they didn't know what they were getting into. And the way it would work with these brokers is all you had to do is get them in for like 90 days, and that was it. As long as they could pay for 90 days and you could keep that rate down, then it would adjust and blow up, and then there's a lot of shorts connected to it and all sorts of just swarmy insanity that was tied to these loans, not just at the base level, but all the way through the food chain. But I didn't finish my point about Kathleen Engel and Patricia McCoy. When they were doing their investigations, they discovered all of this stuff, and they discovered the intent. So I want you to think about this. If you haven't ever heard about this, look it up on YouTube. It still exists. Barack Obama was being interviewed by 60 Minutes, and I believe it was Steve Croft that was interviewing him. It might have been somebody else, but Barack Obama, then President Barack Obama, said, what Wall Street did was gargantuanly unethical, but it wasn't, and then he says like some legalese bullshit, always illegal or something along those lines. Look, Barack Obama knew about predatory lending going back to his time as a junior senator in Illinois, because he wrote anti-predatory legislation with somebody that I interviewed, one of the top guys in the country, a guy by the name of, I can't think of the think tank and the group that he came out of off the top of my head. It's been a while since I've thought of his name. Fantastic consumer advocate attorney, and same with his group out of Washington, D.C. But he wrote the anti-predatory lending legislation with Barack Obama in the mid-'90s. And so by the time you get to Barack Obama's like 2010-11 situation where they're asking questions of President Obama, why didn't anybody get arrested for this? And he said that what Wall Street did was unethical, but it wasn't illegal, which is a lie, which is a monumental lie. But that brings me full circle to what happened in the Federal Reserve. So, for example, Kathleen Engel and Patricia McCoy accumulated all of this information. Again, by the way, these women actually went on to create the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with Elizabeth Warren. They're experts, and they provide this information through the right protocol to the chair of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, a gentleman by the name of Ned Gramlich, who presented it to none other than the chair of the Federal Reserve by the name of Alan Greenspan at that time, who oversaw all of this stuff. And the key there is to understand that Congress, a lot of people don't understand how the Federal Reserve works within the mandate of Congress. Is it independent? Is it controlled by Congress, managed by Congress? It's supposed to be accountable to Congress, but it's not. And this is one of the biggest reasons it's not. So there was a statute called the Homeowner Equity Protection Act that was written to save Americans their equity from equity stripping and predation for everything that I just told you. Meanwhile, President Obama goes on 60 Minutes and says there was no intent. What did I just tell you about the brokers that went inside the Registry of Deeds at City Hall to find out women that had equity in their houses, that lived on fixed incomes, that had some sort of fine on their house that they had to come up with so they could target them for these particular loans that were going to blow up? If that's not intent, what is it, Mr. President? What it is absolute bullshit. They can lie, the President of the United States and the Attorney General of the United States and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve like anybody else can. Because what happened with the Chairman of the Federal Reserve is that Congress had mandated under Homeowner Equity Protection Act that these types of scenarios couldn't happen because the Federal Reserve is where the buck stopped to prevent these loans from happening. They could just turn off the whole valve to enable low interest rates to manifest these loans, which is how it works. Okay? And ultimately, Greenspan, when he got the information from Ned Gramlich that came from Kathleen Engel and Patricia McCoy, was he said, I'm not going to look. I'm not going to do anything about it. What happens in the end? Do you know what happens in the end? I know what happens, and I keep telling you this, and I need this somehow to register because it's insanity, especially in light of like everybody paying attention to everything but this, because I think everything is a distraction to cover this up. Ultimately, the Federal Reserve had to step up and do a backdoor deal where it provided $30 trillion of liquidity to bankrupt shadow sector banks that were involved with what I just told you on a monumental scale. There were $600 trillion of derivatives based on this whole market that went global, that blew up, and the Federal Reserve was the one that had to step up to give the money to the bad guys that destroyed everybody instead of doing what it was mandated to do by Congress. Now, if you watch, for example, Bernie Madoff's documentary on Netflix, or if you've already seen it, called The Monster of Main Street, or excuse me, the Monster of Wall Street. The worst aspect of it all to me was the fact that this guy, Markopoulos, had been a whistleblower. He was a guy who was this physics guru based on derivatives that worked for a competing hedge fund that realized what Bernie was doing was a Ponzi scheme. So he went to the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2000, 2001, all the way through 2008, every year, presenting to him more and more evidence of exactly what Bernie was doing. Nobody in the Securities and Exchange Commission lifted a finger to stop Bernie Madoff. I mean, they did a little bit of investigation, but they took Bernie's word for it, and then they stopped, and they didn't go any further. And there's a lot of revolving door. But the Securities and Exchange Commission, its entire purpose is to prevent what actually happened in Madoff, and to the rest of us, quite frankly, as a result of the 2008 great financial crisis. But they didn't, because in Markopoulos's sort of, filtering and trying to understand why this is that, he says, and this is what I've learned too, the Securities and Exchange Commission is filled with a bunch of attorneys that might be experts in specific sort of paperwork, but they're not investigators, nor do they understand what's happening in finance. So they're useless. So they don't do any investigations, and if you don't look, you don't find. But even when you do look and you do find, if you pipe it up to the top of the food chain to former, chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, and he sits on it, it's like, what the fuck? Oh, we're going to give $30 trillion to the guys that blew up the world, and then everybody's going to sit silent on it. The New York Times sat silent on it. Washington Post, Congress, nobody did anything. And I'm telling you, all of this stuff is the truth, and then some. And so as we reflect upon the Martin Luther King Day and everything that we ourselves should take away from the experience, like any other holiday, whether it's Labor Day or Memorial Day or you name you should have some sort of knowledge of what went into creating that holiday to begin with. For me, I would encourage you to understand this insane corruption that predates on minorities that took, the gains that came out of the civil rights era and then just twisted them and then destroyed them. Absolutely destroyed them, targeted these people, and got away with it. Got away with trillions upon trillions of dollars to bury millions upon millions of people, to throw them out in the street, to have them commit suicide, to get, divorces, and everything else. Addie Polk wasn't the only one. There were thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions if you incorporate all of the different elements of what I'm talking about. We know there were 16 million filed foreclosures. So I hope you'll be horrified by what it is that I'm telling you. I hope that you'll find the work that I'm doing something that inspires you to come on board, because what we have to do is we've got to create a groundswell of informed Americans to the tune of millions to ultimately come together to purge corruption based on the facts that it is that I'm giving you. You can't do what Bernie Sanders and, quite frankly, I hate to say it, Elizabeth Warren, even though she knows all of this stuff, or Dr. Cornel West. You can't think in platitudes. You have to understand who did what, when, and how, and what they got away with. We're doing that right now with the Twitter files. All of these guys on the right can somehow understand that the FBI did all sorts of things with Twitter to target people that they didn't like, a lot of them on the right. And they can understand the nuances of that. Okay, you can understand the nuances of a criminal recipe and an accounting control fraud that led to the devastation of tens of millions of people which is financial terrorism that just morphed out of the African American community and got the rest of the country. And that's the situation we're in 2023. There are the haves and the have-nots, and the haves are fewer and fewer, and they have more and more. And they have more and more because of this financial engineering, this financialization, but ultimately what the Federal Reserve has been able to provide in liquidity to the people that are destroying the nation and the law. They've turned this world, this country, upside down and inside out, and we're all at each other's throats fighting each other. And there's a lot of people on the other ideological spectrum that we recognize that we'll never get along with and that we want to battle with them. But this is a different strata. This is a different strata of who the enemy is. It's the emperor's new clothes. Understand who the enemy is, understand how they operate, understand how if we're going to take anything away from the Martin Luther King holiday, it's to understand all of this stuff has just gone into version 3.0, okay? Maybe 5.0 up to this point. If you believe in liberty and justice for all, you have to fight for it. And that's what I'm doing. I'm leading the surge to create a critical mass of a modern day civil rights movement. And I've got a lot to thank Martin Luther King for. I was inspired by him the whole time. I'm not Martin Luther King. I'm not as smart as he is. I'm not as eloquent. I'm not as inspiring. But let me tell you, I'm as tenacious, and I want to take these guys down like there's no tomorrow. People, we cannot allow this injustice to last any longer. Thanks for listening. Onwards and upwards.